is there a black church? Is there a white church? This kept coming up in the critique when we discussed plantation Christianity. Some people like that's offensive to the Bible. There's no such thing as a black church. And I just wanted us to kind of regroup and discuss this. How do you respond to that critique that there's no such thing as a black church?
Well, it depends on what level we're discussing and speaking about the black church. Now, we know in the strictest, in the most, in the narrowest sense, there's only one church, right? I mean, that's the body of Jesus Christ. But let's be real about this. This is anxiety about race, not about whether there's more than one church, because we have what? The Methodist Church, we have the Catholic Church, we have the Protestant Church, right? We have the Lutheran Church, we have the Episcopalian Church, we have the Presbyterian Church, we have the Greek Orthodox Church, we have the Roman Catholic Church. So we have a comfort zone with putting different modifiers or adjectives in front of the name church. So I'm suspicious, is this about seeking unity, or is this about controlling Black thought and Black identity? So that's my first response to that. Go ahead, please.
Well, then, but if I could, then I would say, well, that's different though, because Methodist, Episcopalian, all of those are around theological issues. So we separate because we had a theological split, but race is not a theological point. So if you say a black church, that's not the same thing as putting those types of denominational labels onto it.
But I would push back, because some have said no. When we divide ourselves along these doctrinal lines, that we are dividing the church, period. So whether we're dividing in terms of doctrine, whether we're dividing in terms of race or culture, arguably no division is desirable in the church. So if you're taking it that way, I don't see it that way. So now, I've answered the question theoretically or theologically, but now let's talk about it politically and socially and historically. Has there been a church? Is there such a thing as the Black church, particularly and especially in the United States of America? Yes, there is such a thing as the Black church. And I think most people understand what we're talking about when we talk about the Black church.
So what do you say we understand? Then that begs the question, what then is the Black church? So as I had my professor in divinity school, he's like, is the Black church? Well, who's the bishop? So, the idea of a Black church as this singular monolithic thing, I think, does not exist. But there is something else that you're alluding to in when you say that everybody understands the Black church to mean something. What does that mean?
Well, yeah, thank you for clarifying. Yes, I would agree with you. And most honest commentators and seekers of the truth would agree that obviously there's no one singular 501c3 called the United Black Church of America. Right. But nevertheless, there is this cultural institution that existed, particularly initially in the South, but now when, after the Great Migration, wherever Black people went, they established these churches, these gathering places. And so we get back to, I'm going to say it was in 1816, when the African Methodist Episcopal Church was established in Philadelphia, Pennsylvania. That was the first, quote unquote, official Black church, if you want to call it that. Mm-hmm. And it was born out of the prejudice of white Christians who snatched Bishop Allen and the other founder of the AME Church.
I think it's Absalom Jones.
Absalom Jones off the altar because they were praying in the white area that was designated for white areas, and they were not in the quote unquote Black area. So there was segregation within the church, the church. So on one hand, you have some of our white brothers and sisters saying the church is united, but within the four walls of the church, there was a space. There was segregation inside the literal physical four walls of the church. And so the Black church was literally and physically born out of a need to have a safe space where we could be treated with dignity and respect, and where we could worship God unobstructed by considerations of race. So that's the beginning of the Black church. That's my initial response. I have other thoughts that I could share along the way.
So you're saying the Black church is rooted in race, or it emerged because of racism. It emerged as a necessity, a response to that.
Absolutely. 100%, 10,000%. it is the creation of white prejudice, of white oppression, of white hypocrisy under the banner of Christianity.
So then again, this kind of begs the question of what does it mean to have the Black church? Because I asked, are we speaking specifically about an American institution? Because you have a Black church presence in Africa, for example. The Ethiopian Tawahidi Church is one of the oldest churches, not just in Africa, but also in the world. It has Black people, although that's debatable whether or not Ethiopians are Black. But assuming that a church in Africa, there's a whole other conversation whether or not they're Black. It's in Africa. They're an African church, right?
Right.
I'm assuming you're not talking about that church when you say the Black church, because if so, then that church is definitely not someone that was created because of oppression.
Well, I'd like to talk about the Tawahedo Church later, because I want to get to the similarities I think that exist between a particular Black church, the Church of God in Christ, and the Tawahedo Church, which is also known as the Ethiopian Orthodox Church. But for now, no, I'm not talking about the churches that exist in Africa that have existed for thousands of years. I'm talking about the churches that were born out of white oppression. I'm talking about the African Methodist Episcopal Church. It's Methodism with an African flair in response to white prejudice and white the sense that white people had that they were superior and above in every respect, spiritually, culturally, in terms of just don't want to be in the physical spaces that we are in because we might literally contaminate them. When I talk about that's the beginning, that's the origin of the Black church, but it's certainly not the whole story. It's not right. The best part of the Black church, because the Black church is so much more than that, right? I mean, right. It is something very, very positive. But the Black church, by the way, was born in the same way that we have historically Black colleges and universities, right?
As a response to racism. Right. But I would even, when you say, so you're putting the start of the institution, the sort of more social religious institution known as the Black church, right, with the advent of AME, African Methodist Episcopal Church.
In
but
I would a formal founding of the quote unquote Black church, I would put it at that point.
I would say that the Black church, though, started before then. Obviously, you're saying formal, informal. You had Black spirituality that was rooted in Christianity during the time of slavery. So you had a lot of what you had these the hush harbors where the enslaved would go and sort of steal away, and have these religious services by themselves outside of the view of the gaze of the white enslavers. And that's when you get sort of our traditions like the ring shout, which is now known as just shouting, just going around, that kind of tradition where people risk their lives just to go out and practice their faith, their spirituality. You had the creation of spirituals and all of that. I say that's kind of the roots of the Black church within America. Again, there is a connection to racism and slavery, but there's also a sense of agency and empowerment that also is at the root of the Black church.
Well, that's a big word, Professor Brooke. When you say agency,
well, yeah, power to
break it down for a guy like myself who may not be as.
Now you know what agency means. Just basically have a sense to be able to control their own self-actualization, to control their lives, the narratives and the things that they practice. They're not, even though they were enslaved, they weren't completely enslaved. They still had parts and portions where they had control or agency over their life. And so I think that the Black church, yes, again, it was responding to racism, it was responding to oppression, but it was also an instance where Black people were able to demonstrate agency and then also incorporate the Africanisms that we think were left behind. And this also was another debate that rose, which is whether or not what we see in the African American church has remnants of African traditionalism, or is it was something completely new. I think it was all the church, when it was in this informal state, served as a place for the Blacks to sort of maintain these African traditions while also practicing their spirituality, their faith, and then creating something new in that. And then it got formalized with the AME Church, which is the first formal Black institution, Christian religious institution, or Christian.
Well,
Yeah.
I may agree with you in terms of, that there's this spirituality that predates our formal um, forming of and formation of the Black AME Church. Absolutely. I mean, I think that people of African descent have always had and demonstrated this remarkable spirituality, which at times was demonized um, as something wicked, something that was paganistic, something that was antithetical to God. But yeah, I think that was going on early on. I think that perhaps that was going on in the Middle Passage. I think if we look at the whole history of Africa, which I'd like to get to the Tawahedo Church. So I don't think that most Christians, Black Christians or otherwise, know about that church, how tenured Christianity is in Africa, which, there's another conversation that we have from time to time about whether or not Christianity is the white man's religion. Well, not if you understand the church history, and particularly African history.